Washington fears that Chinese cars may be able to come over the southern border with zero tariffs under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. While some believe strict compliance to rule of origin regulations can save them, others fear more restrictions may be on the way. Mexico, often perceived in China as a remote and dangerous place, has also become a gold rush destination for Chinese companies looking to serve both the local market and the U.S. As they learn to adapt to a new environment, Washington policymakers are wary. The once and possibly future U.S. President, Donald Trump, is threatening to slap tariffs on products coming from Mexico, including electric vehicles, to block China. In the second of a three-part series, the South China Morning Post looks at how Chinese companies are trying to avoid becoming lightning rods for America's election year rhetoric. Keep a low profile. Such was the advice often repeated by Chinese embassy officials in Mexico to Chinese-funded factories in the country in recent weeks. The factories, however, do not need to be reminded. Warnings from the other side of Mexico's northern border are more evident than ever, with the latest threat coming from former U.S. President Donald Trump, the presumptive Republican nominee in this year's election. China now is building a couple of massive plants where they're going to build the cars in Mexico, and they think that they're going to sell those cars into the United States with no tax at the border. Trump said at a campaign rally in Ohio in mid-March, "We are going to put a 100% tariff on every car that comes across the lot." In Monterrey, an industrial city 140 miles, 225 kilometers, south of the border, many Chinese firms increasingly feel like they are treading on thin ice. Some ventured to Mexico because of worsening Sino-US economic relations, so the last thing they want is to be on a US watch list. But this may be only wishful thinking amid the soaring political discourse that saturates all channels in the US election season. Still, this rhetoric has yet to scare off Chinese firms from coming to Mexico, especially as overcapacity at home spurs efforts to expand. While some believe strict regulatory compliance will spare them from becoming political victims, others fear more barriers may be on the way. So far, the Trump-proclaimed big monster car manufacturing plants built by the Chinese in Mexico have yet to happen. Electric vehicle giant BYD has been evaluating the feasibility of building a facility in the country, indicating that it would aim for the Mexican market instead of the US, according to Mexican officials familiar with the plan. But it is possible the plant could be used as a springboard to the north in the future, they added. BYD did not respond to requests for comment. Growing rapidly in recent years, Chinese EV manufacturers have been able to drive down costs, helping China surpass Japan to become the world's largest car exporter last year. But, thanks to the additional 25% tariffs imposed during the Trump administration, the US has largely kept Chinese EVs at bay. And now Washington fears that Chinese cars may be able to come over the southern border with zero tariffs under the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, devastating its automotive industry, a bedrock of the US manufacturing ecosystem. The introduction of cheap Chinese autos, which are so inexpensive because they are backed with the power and funding of the Chinese government, to the American market could end up being an extinction-level event for the U.S. auto sector, the Alliance for American Manufacturing, an advocacy group, said in a report in February. While such a scenario is still hypothetical, an increasing amount of Chinese investment in Mexico, and especially in Monterrey, is flowing to factories serving as upstream manufacturers of parts such as suspension components, all looking to supply big names like Tesla. The U.S. carmaker owned by billionaire Elon Musk announced its plan to build a gigafactory in the Monterrey area last year, though it is yet to break ground. But many Chinese car parts suppliers there have already put their facilities into operation, currently supplying Tesla factories in Austin, Texas, and Fremont, California. One thing is politics, and everyone is talking about it. The other one is like, when companies come set up as a Mexican manufacturing facility here, hiring Mexican employees and complying with the rule of origin, they can definitely supply to the U.S. market free of taxes, said Emmanuel Liu, Undersecretary of Investment of the Ministry of Economy in Nuevo Leon, where Monterrey is the capital. Under the USMCA, which replaced the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 2020, as long as 75% of auto content, including key parts, are made in North America, the products can qualify for rule of origin to export to the U.S. Since the fourth quarter of 2021, 30% of all foreign companies investing in Nuevo Leon have been from China, compared to 55% from the US during the same period, Liu said. We didn't used to have that many Chinese companies. We once had a lot of Koreans, Japanese, and Europeans. Now China has become the strong number 2 investor in Monterrey, Liu said. In value terms, Chinese investment in the state is still in its infancy, as small suppliers rather than big international brands constituted the majority. According to official statistics, in the first 3 quarters of 2023, the top sources of foreign direct investment in Nuevo Leon were Argentina at $1.39 billion, the Netherlands at $557 million and the US at $401 million, while that from China was only $34.8 million. But the number may be underestimated. Some Chinese companies have used their overseas subsidiary to invest in Mexico to avoid being labeled as Chinese investment in the official record, according to factory managers and experts. Therefore, from 2018 to 2023, in Mexico the actual figure for Chinese foreign direct investment, which traces the original source of transactions back to the country, should be about $10 billion, compared with the $2.3 billion total from Mexico's Secretariat of Economy, according to Enrique Dussel-Peters, a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. In Nuevo Leon, there have been some Chinese companies coming and setting up facilities without notifying the local government, Liu said. For some of them, we only found out when, for example, the labor secretary went there for inspections, Liu added. Beyond these precautions, many Chinese factory managers said they believe that strict compliance with the USMCA will eventually save them. From the business perspective, we cannot be just scared away. The Chinese can always find a way out, said Chen Yi, an administration director at Hengli, Mexico. Originally from Jiangsu province, Hengli is a hydraulic component supplier to engine equipment manufacturers like Caterpillar, and its plant in Monterrey is expected to begin operations this year. As long as we comply with all the requirements under the USMCA and obtain the rule of origin certificate, and be ready for inspections and review at all times, Chen said. But Jorge Guajardo, former Mexican ambassador to China and currently a partner at Denton's Global Advisors, said the US could easily use non-tariff barriers to make it harder for Chinese-funded companies to prove they meet the rule of origin. During USMCA negotiations, the US added a chapter in which US labor groups can request inspections at foreign plants in Mexico when labor rights violations are suspected. So far, it has been used more as harassment than an actual implementation, and my guess is they are going to start targeting Chinese-owned companies in Mexico, Guajardo said. This echoes the experience of a Chinese factory manager in Monterrey, whose company's products are undergoing anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigation by the US. If the United States really wants to target a certain company, the USMCA would not be able to protect you at all, the manager said on condition of anonymity. Officials in US President Joe Biden's administration are already on high alert regarding Chinese investments in Mexico. In December, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen visited Mexico to strengthen cooperation on security and financial issues, with the two sides agreeing to establish a mechanism to monitor and screen foreign investments in the country. But some Mexican officials and trade experts say no one in the country knows how to implement such an investment screening. Kenneth Smith Ramos, a partner at Mexican international consulting firm Aegon and the country's former chief negotiator for USMCA, said the Mexican government would balk at a practice that it would see as discriminating against foreign firms. There is an open investment environment in Mexico, Smith Ramos said in March, adding that excluding Chinese participation under USMCA is hard to implement or justify based on current international trading rules. How do you not get onto a slippery slope where other countries start discriminating against North American products just by virtue of being North American, and by claiming that they can be a danger to national security of other export markets that are important to North America? He said. Still, U.S. pressure on the Mexican government can never be overlooked owing to the leverage that Washington has. Around 85% of Mexico's exports go to the U.S., and Mexico overtook China last year to become America's top source of imports. We are just too dependent on America as a partner, said Victor Gonzalez, a senior advisor for China Latin America legal affairs at Beijing-based law firm PC Wu and Zhonglun Wendy. For the economic relationship between China and Mexico, it is never truly bilateral but always trilateral, as the U.S. is always in the equation, he added. It's just a matter of time that it becomes political and the economic aspect will become secondary, Gonzalez said. Nevertheless, the U.S.'s dependence on lower-cost products made in Mexico and the inability of local industry to provide all the necessary elements of the supply chain presented an opportunity for Beijing, said Eduardo Tselia Pango, professor of China Studies at Mexico's Metropolitan Autonomous University. He stressed that trade relations between Mexicans and Chinese have always been contentious, as many sectors such as footwear, textiles and toys have suffered from Chinese competition since the country became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2001. But as Mexico was unable to advance in more technology-intensive sectors, such as electronic components, inevitably it became dependent on the Chinese supply chain. In order to export more to the North American market, we have to import more from China, Celia Pango said. For Simon Zhao, who came to Mexico from China 14 years ago and later founded SolarEver, a Mexican solar panel manufacturer now expanding business scope to EV and batteries, industrial inputs from the Chinese supply chain are irreplaceable for his industry. Of course, we need suppliers from China. As a leader in Mexico for the renewable energy sector, if we want to grow better, we need to cooperate internationally, including with China, the US and Europe, Zhao said. Despite policy uncertainties, for many Chinese manufacturers that have already set foot in Mexico, there is almost no way back. We have bought land and built factories. Of course we are worried. But now we can only move forward, said Eric Liu, general manager at Sunan, an office furniture producer in Mexico. The company, originally from Zhejiang province, was convinced by its US clients to move to Mexico in 2021. And invested $70 million in its Monterrey factory that went into operation 2 years later. Compared to the automobile sector, the furniture industry involves fewer technical barriers, and thus has attracted little US attention. But higher costs, from labor, logistics and local procurement in order to comply with the rule of origin under the USMCA, have yet to justify the move, Liu said. As of the end of last year, Sunan's general operation costs in Mexico were 38% higher than in China, compared with the 25% US tariffs imposed on furniture imports directly from China. If Trump gets elected again and elevates tariffs on Chinese imports, producing in Mexico would make more sense, Liu said. The former president, however, could be an even bigger disruptive element for the economic dynamic between China and Mexico, said Celia Pango. If Trump wins, one of the biggest political pressures on Mexico might be renegotiating USMCA with the condition that we reduce our trade relations with China, he said.